Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Bill Lester. I'm with University of Florida IFAS Extension Service here in Hernando County. And today we have a special guest presentation with Dr. Eban Bean with University of Florida. Dr. Bean is with the Agricultural and Biological Engineering Department at University of Florida, which sounds kind of complicated because he works a lot with watershed hydrology, stormwater management, a lot of things that apply to different soils and water and turf grass. But he's going to talk today about the importance of the soil that you're trying to grow your lawn in. Because as we were talking before the class today, a lot of people seem to think that if they have a problem with their lawn, they're going to fix it with just watering it more and putting down more fertilizer. And a lot of times that is not going to fix it, and that might not be what the underlying problem is. So let me go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Bean here and let him go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here, and hopefully you guys can see all that, correct? Yes? Showing up on
Yes, I can see it. It's working.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you all for being here today. It's a privilege to be invited by Bill to speak to you about some of the work we have going on and kind of really some of the lessons we've learned from how the soils really affect how well our lawns are growing. And hopefully you come away from this understanding why in the conventional development and the way that construction's done, it creates an issue with basically trying to grow just about anything, but particularly lawns in general. So let me kind of give you start with sort of an overview. Kind of just want to have sort of a background on soils and urban landscapes. I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of information about some of the past research we've done and kind of boil that down to some key points. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the work we have going on right now that's pretty exciting. And then I'll point you to some guidance documents we have, some resources that you may be interested in, and talk a little bit about some policy resources. And then hopefully we'll have some time for question and answer. So let's jump right into it. Here in Florida, we have gotten really efficient at the home building process, if you haven't noticed. It basically takes about 65 days. If you talk to the developers and the builders and so forth, it takes about 65 days to go from a flat lot to a fully complete home. So today is we're in the 22nd of June. So we're basically talking, by the end of August, you could go from a flat lot to a fully built home. And what that means is that there's a lot of traffic going on the landscape during that process. There's a lot of heavy vehicles driving across it, dropping off materials, pumping concrete, dropping off shingles, doing all the steps of the construction process. But it also means that during the wetter parts of the year or wetter days, we're not taking time off. We're not waiting. They're not waiting for that soil to dry out. And oftentimes the material that is left at the top of the lot, the soil is a builder's material or a sand that has been brought in to build up the lot so that water drains off of it, but also so that it drains or doesn't have a whole lot of doesn't hold a lot of water, so that we've got a firm foundation. This is a graphic that basically, I don't want to get you too worried about the complexities here, but basically we have how dense the soil is on the left side, and then on the bottom we have basically how wet the soil is. And each of these curves is a different type of soil, different texture. So in most parts of Florida, we're dealing with one of these sandier soils up here, these 1, 2, or 3s up here. High percentage of sand. And essentially what we're talking about in this graphic is that we see that at one end, at the very dry end, we have that's sort of one of the lower points. Okay, so we have this hump for each of these curves. The lower end on each end, on one end is the soil it reaches a point where it can't compact anymore. You can't get it any more dense because the friction between the particles prevents the particles from moving. On the other end, we get so much water into the soil, the water actually prevents the compression from occurring any further. So if we actually wanted to optimize the compaction, we would want to wet and dry, and load and unload this, or basically, put a compaction force on it as it's kind of going through this wetting and drying cycle. And this is essentially what's happening in our landscapes, but it's also kind of what you want to do if you wanted to stabilize a roadbed or do sort of a structural foundation. But it's not the best for trying to grow vegetation in landscape. So with soil compaction, we know that essentially there's a couple of processes that are affected by the compaction. Number one, we have less infiltration. So when we compress those particles together, we reduce the amount of air space or space in between those particles that water can actually infiltrate the soil, and that air can move through the soil. And so it makes it a lot slower for water to soak into the soil. This generates more runoff, and we've probably all seen the impacts of urban runoff, particularly with the impacts of nutrients on our waterways here in Florida. But it has other effects. And some of the main ones are how it directly affects the vegetation that's trying to establish in this soil. The roots of a plant will naturally basically push into that soil and then die back each year seasonally, and leave these basically old root channels that water and air can kind of move through. And they'll put more roots down each year. So gradually over time, it will kind of mitigate this soil compaction. However, the soil can be so compact in many cases that it prevents the roots from actually penetrating into the soil and sinking those roots down. So we end up with a fairly shallow root zone, and you may have even seen this sort of the carpeting effect that occurs every once in a while. This basically inhibits, this vegetation is less drought tolerant, more sensitive to pests and other types of stress, and often requires or needs or can't go without watering as long in between. It's more dependent on irrigation. And so that's somewhere around in the state of Florida, we're talking somewhere around 750 million gallons per day go to residential irrigation. All right, that's a lot of water each day. So one of the sites that we've kind of worked in quite a bit is not too far from you in Hernando County. We're over in Marion County, and on top of the world. And I think that a lot of the soils that we're dealing with here, they're Candler fine sands, and I think that's pretty common in Hernando County as well. So we're going to see a lot of translations between what we have here at On Top of the World. Probably applies to what you have in Hernando County. So this is an active adult community. They have about 6,000 homes currently, but they have a build out projected of about 30,000 homes. And they're within Swiftmud, just the Southwest Florida Water Management District, just as you are. And the average water usage per day is about 250 gallons per home per day. But on Top of the World, their permit, they wanted to be good stewards, basically reduce their water consumption, water conservation. So they reduced their permit to 150 gallons per home per day. And they got down to about 190 gallons per home per day, and then brought us in and wanted to try and look at exploring other ways that they could conserve water. They basically tapped out all the indoor efficiencies, and had gone with only 60% turf in the landscape, but still weren't hitting that 150 gallons per home per day. So this is the first study I kind of want to walk you through real quick. This is basically 10 model homes that we have here, and this is the one that is not going to be included in the study. But essentially, we use 9 of those homes. All right, so 3 of them in the landscape, we left that soil compacted, just like it would be if a homeowner, if a contractor came in, built the home, and then sodded it, just like any other home. 3 of them, we took a product that you may be familiar with called Command. It's an organic compost, and we put down about an inch depth, and then incorporated that into the top 6 inches. This was just before the irrigation lines went in, and the day before they laid down the sod and put in the landscaping. And in this case, we used Empire Zoysia, and some other studies I'll show you, we're using St. Augustine. So, just kind of know we're looking at several different types of turf here. And then we also wanted to know, kind of looking at how the soils improve, we wanted to see what kind of benefit we got from just tilling the soil. So if we didn't include the compost, we didn't have to manage another material on site. If we can just get away with tilling the soil, that would be a real benefit to getting this to translate into practice. So we basically incorporated into the top 6 inches of that soil on 3 of the homes and so forth. So kind of looking at this graph here, hopefully you can tell that one of these lines, without even going into what it's showing, one of these lines is a lot different from the other. So the green line here is the compost amended soil, or the command soil. And then the yellow line and the red lines, which are basically right on top of each other, are the tilled and the compacted soils. And what we're showing here is basically how well these soils hold on to water. What you see here is the volumetric water content. And then on the bottom here is basically the pressure. And so this is important for a couple reasons, but mainly because it kind of really gets into how much water the soil can hold on to and then provide back to the plant. So soil in many ways is like a sponge. You take a sponge off the countertop, you run it underneath the spigot or the faucet, and you loosen it up and you soak it. And there's some amount of water, if you pull it out from underneath the faucet, that's just going to drain right out. You're not going to be able to hold on to it. It's just going to, it's just going to drain through it. Same thing happens in our landscapes. The soil, oftentimes, there's some amount of water basically that is not going to be held by the soil for longer than basically 24 hours. And that's what's basically in this blue zone. At the other end, if you tried to squeeze all that water out, you're going to get most of it out, but there's going to be some amount of water that you can't squeeze out of the sponge. And similarly, there's an amount of water that plants just can't pull out of the soil. This is basically unavailable to the plant. So this is basically our permanent wilting point. But what's available to the plant for a longer period is what is in this green zone. And so I'm going to show it to you more in sort of percentages or fractions of the volumes here. And so what we found is that throughout the study, you see here the blue is, this is the water that basically goes through the soil too quickly. So it fills up the soil, then drains through, and it's so fast it's not available to the plants. The orange is the fraction of the soil that is basically, it has water, but it's not available to the plants. And so this green bar here indicates the plant available water. And you could think of these as 7.8%, 10.6%, 21.1%. The key that we found several times basically throughout this 2-year study was that the null or the control and compacted soil and the tilled soil were essentially had the same physical properties. The way they held water and interacted with water didn't really change. I was a little surprised by this, but when you think about sand, it doesn't really hold a lot of structure. You think about a clay, you can form and mold clay, it'll hold structure. So when you till that sand up and then put sod on it, water it down, and give it like a little bit of time, it's going to eventually settle back down and recompact to its pre-compact state. Well, by incorporating the compost, what we found is that it essentially holds that structure better, incorporates a lot more porosity or volume of water and air to kind of exchange through the soil, and basically was able to hold twice as much water as the unamended soils. And one of the questions we had coming into this was, well, how long is this going to last? Is this going to be kind of a 1 year, you incorporate that compost, but then it burns off? Well, this is in November 8, 2018. We did the amending in January of 2017. So this is 22 months afterwards, nearly 2 growing seasons afterwards. And in this next slide, what I'll ask you to do is kind of to see if you can pick out which ones were amended. You think about it, if it's holding a lot more water and there's a lot more nutrients that are available in the compost as well, that should translate into better turf quality. And one other thing that I forgot to mention is that all of these lawns were irrigated the same. Keep in mind, this is a model home area of a development. It's just like the real world without homeowners. It's my favorite research site that I've ever had. But it basically, I didn't want to, do anything that would stress the grass or cause it to the lawns to fail. All right, so this doubling of the plant available water, you should be able to, hopefully you can pick out which ones are the amended lots. So I'll tell you, just along this back row, we'll kind of just focus there. There's a tilled, there's either one tilled and two compacted, or two compacted and one tilled. They look the same. And then there's two amended. So if you think about lots 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, there's two of them that are amended, and hopefully you picked out that they were 3 and 5. The other amended lot is here. It's kind of hard to see because the shadow in the backyard kind of small, but you can definitely tell sort of in the front yard that it just looks healthier. And again, these lawns are getting the same irrigation application throughout the week and so forth. Moving on to another study, we kind of also wanted to see, how soils kind of develop on their own. All right, what happens over time in these landscapes? So we sort of started with looking at what's the comparison between our new constructed lot and an undeveloped sort of forested area, or basically an unimpacted area. And so you can tell that there's a lot of different kind of soil properties or changes here, but kind of to summarize or say what the key is. The first thing is this depth to refusal. So this is a grad student, Casey Kowalski, who is basically putting all of her weight onto this soil core that's about that big around in the new construction lot. And this thing is not going into the ground. So this is going, she was able to maybe get it just under 12 inches, but then this was about 4 or 5 feet longer than that. And then we go to bulk density. This is again how compact the soil is. 1.2 is our undisturbed or undeveloped density. 1.75 is compacted. This translates to porosity, how much air and water is in that soil. And so here in the undeveloped soil, we have about 50% of that soil volume is available for air and water to exchange. We've dropped that down to about 30%, 34% in the new construction. Our soils don't have a whole lot of organic matter, so not as much of a surprise there. And then with pH, in our natural soils, we have sort of a lower pH, more acidic, more organics that can, more acidic soil, acidic compounds in the soil. Whereas in our new construction, we're probably getting some of the limestone that's in the subsurface kind of mixed in. A lot of times we'll see that kind of bringing up the pH. It can be a big issue, particularly if we get it too high. We've seen pHs in the 8s where they're trying to grow, St. Augustine and zoysia, and it just does not do very well in that kind of condition. So looking at how the soil develops over time, we looked again in On Top of the World, and they've been developing since basically the early 90s, which gave us a great area to kind of look at what's happening to soils that are essentially created at the same way at their time zero, and look at them over this age gradient. So we had different areas of development of different age times, pre-1995, 95 to 2005, 2006, 07, 2013, 2015. And I should now say that these areas here were more, that 2018, 2019 timeframe. And we looked at the soil characteristics, several of them in the mulch bed and the lawns. And it was really interesting what we were able to see. And I'm just going to show you sort of the bulk density here, because there was a lot of data, but I kind of want to move on and hit some other things. First of all, you see that we have the beds and the lawns. And you'll notice that during construction, we had the exact same soil characteristics at time zero, just right at the new construction. And so what we see is that in the blue bars, which is basically the top 6 inches, and then we have higher compaction down at 6 to 12 inches. They start out high, but then they decrease over time. They will kind of decrease back to a lower value. And of relevance for these last values here, they both were at 1.24. They're basically exactly where sort of that forested soil bulk density was. So it's sort of interesting that, it takes 30 years of, vegetation kind of loosening that soil and sort of developing that soil. But we do kind of get back to a pre-compacted quasi, at least in the top 6 inches, soil bulk density. But a couple of things as well to kind of point out. Number one, our 6 to 12 inches stays pretty high. And it does take, again, it takes several decades to really kind of mitigate this on its own. So yes, we can wait for this to occur, but looking at our soil compaction, we can, well, amending with soils, we can look at how to kickstart that soil formation process more effectively, and kind of get those soils developed maybe more quickly. So a couple of things to kind of take away from this, what we call the Chrono Sequence here. Construction basically compacts this fill material or soils in the new lots. So we end up with a fairly compacted material that we're trying to grow plants in it. This causes those vegetation to be more drought sensitive and less resilient to stress. We do get this decompaction or compaction mitigation, that process that occurs over time, and the rooting depth does increase with time. So we also looked at sort of how far we could push down a probe at different age soils. It does increase over time, but the time frame for these processes to occur is on the order of 2 to 3 decades. Okay, so a long time for that to establish. All right, so we had some good results from there, and this kind of set the stage to look at, okay, how is this actually going to work in the real world? So with soil amendments and compost. With the model homes, we didn't have homeowners to kind of, come in and do things the way they want to and kind of change things. So in this phase with this study, we looked at real world scenario here. And so we had 24 homes. 7 of them were compost amended with command, same type of application, basically 1 inch into the top 6 inches, or 4 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet. And we had 8 sites that were tilled, same, down to 6 inches, no compost, and then 9 that were controls, or basically they were left compacted. And then we applied these treatments just before the landscaping went in, just before the irrigation went in. And then we started monitoring this in July of 2018 through October of 2020. One thing I want to mention, though, is that each of these homes had a HydroWise irrigation controller. What we asked each of the homeowners to do at the beginning of this study was to reduce their runtimes, their irrigation runtimes, by 25%. So they were pretty standard set basically all at 45% for their, or 45 minutes for their irrigation for lawns. We asked them to reduce it by 25%, which took it down to, I believe, somewhere in that 33, 35 minute runtime duration, with the caveat that they could at any point return it back to their runtime, their full runtime, if they thought their turfgrass needed it. And so some of the things that we monitored here is we also wanted to look at if there were benefits to runoff reduction. If we're improving infiltration in the landscape, we should be retaining more water. And so therefore, if we're retaining more water, we're reducing runoff, and maybe there's a stormwater credit for that. And maybe this stormwater pond that's up here in the upper left-hand corner that you can just kind of see the edge of, maybe that could be smaller. And that would be a huge incentive for a developer to do this on their own. We also installed soil moisture sensors to kind of look at how the water content varied over time in these homes. We looked also at total home and some of the irrigation water usage. We had some issues where we were able to access and view the irrigation that homeowners were applying. But then there's always, homeowners are always, they always give us sort of a they're a representation of the entire population. So we had one guy that was, very concerned that someone, if he gave us access to view his irrigation data, that we might be able to basically hack into his home network and steal his identity and so forth. So he did not grant us access for that. So it's kind of just things you have to kind of roll with. We also collected leaching volumes and nutrient concentrations. So if we pair this with the runoff, this is really kind of getting at, okay, we incorporate compost into the soil. Compost is sort of the very first slow release fertilizer, if you think about it. So we are incorporating nutrients and introducing those in the landscape. Are we having sort of a unintended consequence of amending those soils by potentially releasing nutrients into runoff or into leachate? So we wanted to make sure and kind of look at that as well. So looking at the summary over 2 years, what did we see from homeowners with the changes to their irrigation? Keep in mind, we asked them to reduce their runtime by 25%. So to drop down to 75% of what the initial runtime was. In the control or the compacted lots, we had 6 homes that we had data on. 3 of them stayed at the 75% runtime. 1 returned their home's runtime back to 100%, and 2 increased the runtime above 100% or above the 45-minute runtime for their lawns. With the tilled lots, we did see a little bit of a benefit. 2 actually decreased their runtimes below 75%, so below 33 minutes. 2 stayed at the 25% reduction, and then 1 returned it back to the 45-minute, 100% runtime. But then with the compost lot, the compost amended soils, we had 3 that decreased their irrigation actually by about 55%. So they actually reduced it down to in the 20 minutes of the runtime. And there was only 1 lot that basically returned their irrigation back to 100%. And there's some people out there that the old adage is you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. This guy, great guy, but he wanted to have the best looking lawn. So he was going to use all the water that he was allowed to use or recommended to use. And he did not know, none of these homeowners knew what kind of soil they had or what their role was necessarily in the study. But, and he had a magnificent looking lawn. I mean, it looked like a sports field with the whole like mowing at different angles and everything like that. It was impressive, but I don't know that he's representative of what a typical homeowner would do in an amended lot. So this was really actually encouraging, and I'll get to how we're building on this more. But there's some more data that suggests we should maybe could reduce the irrigation even further than just 25%. What I'm showing you here is kind of the soil moisture over time, and what I want to kind of show is just some differences that we see with the composted soils, the tilled, and the composted or the control or compacted. What you should see up here is that our composted soils stay high after this rain event. So we see that all of the soil moisture sensors kind of tick up all at the same time. This is not staggered like irrigation would be, so this is indicative of a rain event. Saturated the soils, and it holds on to that water for a pretty long time. We did see that some of the tilled soils, 2 of the tilled lots actually did as well, but they weren't the ones that were getting top dressing. And I haven't mentioned much about top dressing here in this study because it was inconclusive. So we don't have a really great feel or data that supports what the actual expected benefits can be of using top dressing from water conservation perspective yet. And then we have the controls here, and what you see with most of these soils is it goes up really quickly and then it drops down really quickly. Again, not holding on to much of that water, it's just kind of draining through if it's getting into that soil, and it's going back down to that baseline pretty quickly. All right. So we can even see statistically that our compost had significantly greater water content than our tilled, and then which was significantly greater than our control. What was sort of strange, and we haven't really figured this out, is that our top dressing, which was basically putting down half a cubic yard twice per year, those lots actually had a lower volumetric water content, slightly, but significantly, than our not top dressed lawns. So not what we would expect. And so it's, again, not really conclusive about what's going on with the top dressing. With lysimeters, this is looking at basically how much water would be leaching into the groundwater from our different lawns. And what you should see, what I wanted to point out here is our black dotted line is our cumulative rainfall over the monitoring period. The gray lines that we see that are higher up here are our compost. So we had a lot of leachate volume, which means that a lot of the water that's falling or being applied to it there's a lot of water that's going through that root zone. Next up, we sort of see two kind of clusters of the tilled lots, a little bit lower, but not significant. I don't believe it's significant. A little bit lower leachate that occurs from the tilled root zone. And then our compacted soils are largely clustered here at the bottom. The soil is pretty compacted. Not a lot of water is getting into that soil. And so we should see more runoff and not a lot of water is being able to drain out. Okay. And what we see here is that average monthly leachate, we're seeing, 13.4 centimeters from the compost amended soil and 2.7 centimeters from the control. Again, not much of a difference with our top dressing either. Okay, now nitrogen leaching. So this is somewhat interesting. Some of it we don't have a real good feel on it. But what I want to start out with is this is looking at basically the total loading of nitrogen that's coming out of the root zone and would end up in the groundwater. In Springs area, we're particularly interested in trying to reduce that and limit the amount of nitrogen going into that. So in our compacted soils, this is our treatments here in and in. This basically means our null or our control and the not top dressed, and then our null and our top dressed. We basically didn't see any significant difference there in our loadings. And the loadings here, are pretty low. And this is what we're going to see over and over, or what was a common trend, was that we didn't have a lot of differences in concentrations between what was coming out of the bottom of the root zone across compost or compacted or tilled. It really is a volume story. Okay. And this gets into our irrigation management. With our tilled soils, we did have much higher nitrogen loadings kind of coming out, and this is, again, we see with the top dressed, the tilled and yes top dressed, this had a higher loading than our tilled without top dressing. And then here's our command or our control, or command or compost amended, not top dressed, and then compost amended that was top dressed. Sort of interesting that our tilled had higher loadings than our compost, but we think this is maybe due to just more retention of the compost amended soil of the nutrients that are available in the soil, whereas the tilled soil basically allowed those to flush out. So compost was significantly greater than the compacted soils. So, but what does this mean? Well, a couple things here. With runoff, we basically had no significant differences in concentrations or loadings. Okay, there was actually lower runoff volumes from the compost amended soils. So there could be some potential crediting or benefit to reducing runoff by amending soils. The root zone, the composted soil had a higher water availability, basically. And the homeowners that had this soil actually reduced their irrigation by about 55%, more than what we recommended to them. They reduced it on their own. And even with these reductions from the compost amended lots, we even still saw that there was no significant difference in nutrient concentrations, but there was significantly higher nitrogen loading from the compost amended soils. So this means that this is volume driven because concentrations aren't changing, but the volume is greater from the composted soils. So what that suggests is that even at 25% or 55%, we may be able to reduce the irrigation even further by when we have amended the soils. So coming out of this study, we wanted to look at a couple, we still had some remaining questions. So one of the main ones here is how much can we actually reduce the irrigation by? You're coming out of that homeowner study, 25% reduction seems pretty conservative. The homeowners, were happy with their lawns. Several of them pushed it to 55% reduction, and even that seemed to be from a groundwater perspective. We ought to be able to reduce it even further. So how much compost is needed to realize these benefits? Right now, the recommended application rate is 4 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet. But what if we reduce that amount to 2 or 1 cubic yard per 1,000 square feet? That would reduce the amount of nutrients that we're introducing that are a part of the compost. So maybe that's something we should look at. And then, we've done a lot of work with one particular product, and that's been the Command product. Life Soils is a great partner to work with, but as IFAS, I strongly believe that we should be brand agnostic, or basically not endorse any particular product. Our recommendations should be sort of descriptive, meaning we say if the product has these parameters or these qualities, then it should produce this outcome. Do the different brands or different materials produce different results? And so going into this next study, this is at our research farm in Citra, which is kind of halfway between Gainesville and Ocala. And again, very sandy soils, very similar to what we had at On Top of the World, and sort of similar to what I think a lot of the areas in Hernando County have. And so we had 120 plots that we were able to basically implement and experiment on and look at essentially how the different amendment rates, amendment types, and irrigation rates, how that affected turf quality. And so what you can see here is we started this in August of 2019, and you can hopefully pick out some of the different colored plots and how dark or light they are. The darker the plot, the higher the amendment rate that we applied there and incorporated. And you can see some of these plots basically aren't amended, or they're basically still look like flat soil. Those are our controls that remain compacted. We sodded this with St. Augustine, and you can see we were very glad to be done with that sodding there. And each of these plots is 10 feet by 10 feet. And so you can see that, in August 2019, then we were basically coming right up against, going into the dormant season in September, October, November. So we didn't really get started. And we weren't really going to get started until the spring of 2020. And if you remember, there was this little thing called COVID that happened. So that delayed us a little bit more, but we really got things kind of going in June. And basically what we were doing is collecting turf quality ratings, basically scoring the ratings of each of these plots on a weekly to biweekly time frame. So you can see here in June 2020, we have some differentiation between the different plots and sort of how they're looking. By September, we were getting a lot of rain, wet time of the year. Everything's basically doing pretty well. And then, we hit dormancy in December, and you'll see in some of our data, we hit dormancy hard. It shut down and went brown quick. And then in March, you can see that March of this year, that things were starting to come back, starting to green up just a bit. It was sort of a mild spring, so to speak. If at least up here in Gainesville, where it didn't get just oppressively hot really quickly. It didn't go from winter, that 1 or 2 weeks of winter, straight into summer. It took a while for things to warm up. So this is sort of the study that we did. We have sort of 2 studies that we looked at here. I'm going to kind of go through this pretty quickly because the details, I just want to get to sort of what the results were here. But essentially what we wanted to look at here were 3 irrigation rates. Okay, so we used 75% of the IFAS recommendation, the same as that 25% reduction. We used 25% of the IFAS recommendation, which is 75%, and then 50% of the irrigation rate, and then a 0. We had some plots that were not irrigated. 4 amendment treatments. We had a control, and then 3 commercially available products that we just labeled A, B, and C. And then all of these all of these plots were at the high application rate of 4 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet for replicates. So looking at this part of the study, we wanted to collect soil samples and look at different soil characteristics at the beginning and ending of each growing season. What I have today is basically the summary of results from the beginning and ending of the first growing season. We've collected the beginning of the second growing season, but obviously we haven't gone through the full analysis of that, and we haven't gotten to the end of it by any means. And then approximately weekly, we collect those turf quality ratings, as well as looking at irrigation depths, rainfall, and evapotranspiration parameters. So basically how wet and dry it was. Just to give you an idea of what that turf rating looks like. So there's what we would rate as a 3. You get quite a bit of brownness. You get some patches in 4, 5. You can still make out some brownness. 6, just barely. 7, you're not looking like you have a whole lot of brownness, but you maybe have some variability in the greenness. And then 8 is starting to look really good, and 9 is basically perfect. In this study, the NTP, the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program, recommends a 6 as the minimally acceptable. In this study, we went to a 5, just saying that maybe our homeowners, depending on where they're at, may just kind of be a little bit more able to tolerate a little bit lower quality, but we'll see. So it's kind of a busy graph, but I'm going to kind of walk you through it. Here we have sort of the turf rating, and that's what this value is here on the y-axis. That's what these bars are, is basically the average turf rating for each treatment. Okay, so we have our control and then our 3 amendment, all at that 4 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet. And then this black line here is our rainfall plus irrigation minus ET, which is basically our, how wet or dry it was. So for example, June was pretty wet, and then we dropped down to July, which was drier. August, September was really wet. And I don't know if you remember, but the aerial photo of September was looking really green across the board. Kind of dropped down in October, got a little bit drier, November, and then we hit dormancy in December. You remember how I said it hit dormancy hard? We went from basically having 7 to 8 down to 4 in 1 month. And so here what we see is that there's not a lot of difference among the amendments. We do seem to have about a point, if we call it a point system, about a point, maybe 1.5 better turf quality than the control or compacted soil if we amend with that 4 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet. Now this is at 25% reduction. Now we're going to half or 50% reduction. And so our scores, our turf quality ratings kind of drop down a little bit. What you'll notice though is there's not a whole lot of difference. There's a little bit of difference, about a half a point between the different amendment types. And these are commonly available compost brands. You could probably come up with what these are, or at least some ideas of what they would be. Our controls, again, we're still hanging out about a point and a half higher than the controls, and we see that we basically maintained everything is above that acceptable 5 value during the season. And you're going to see this black line of the water balance kind of tick down as we reduce the irrigation further. Getting down, this is 75% reduction in the irrigation. Okay, and so here we're kind of down to about maybe now half to 3/4 of a point greater than our control plots. Here we're getting much less, less of a difference here because we've got so much rain kind of making up for it. And then in October, when we have the reduction in irrigation or in rainfall, I'm sorry, we sort of see that separation, that the control or unamended soil kind of responds where it drops off quicker, whereas the other amended soils kind of stay higher for longer. Okay, but still everything's above that 5. Now, when we get to the non-irrigated plots, this is where we really kind of tripped, went into too stressful of a situation. Each of these stars indicates how many plots would basically have failed during the month. We had to basically put these on recovery irrigation to bring them back to health. And if you'll notice, each one of our amendments at 4 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet without irrigation basically would have failed, at least one replicate would have failed in each of those treatments, okay, during the time frame from June to September. Interestingly, once we got sort of through September and October, things were kind of able to hang on. And I think that's because our ET dropped off. It wasn't as hot, and we were able to kind of maybe benefit from some wetness in September. But I don't think that, non-irrigated is going to be a plausible or a real good, we're not there yet, let's put it that way. The second design, I'm just going to go through really quickly because it kind of, the results are fairly general. Here we were basically looking at different amendment rates, high, medium, and low, 4, 2, and 1 cubic yard. And here we use 6 amendment types. So 5 commercially available products, the same A, B, E, and C, and then we added in a D and an E along with the controls. 4 replicates, and then all of these were irrigated at the 50% IFAS recommendation. What you're going to see through each of these is, so here we have A is A amendment with 1 cubic yard, A amendment with 2 cubic yards, A amendment with 4 cubic yards. What we generally see is that there is somewhat of a benefit to having more compost, but oftentimes it's not significantly greater once you get to above 1 or 2 and go to 4. Okay, there's a big significant jump from your control or compacted, non-amended to 1 or 2, but then once you get from 2 to 4, not really there as much. Similar here, we see some variation where in some cases, for example, here, for whatever reason, the 2 cubic yards slightly lower than the 1 cubic yard here and here, here and here. But essentially, we see sort of diminishing returns as you increase the compost. Same thing for C. Again, in this instance, we had the 2 cubic yards was slightly lower than the 1 cubic yards, and in a couple of these other cases. But essentially, what that means is that there's no significant difference. Same thing with D, a little bit more predictable. We have a slight increase between from controls to 1 cubic yard and then the 2 cubic yards. But once you get to 4, diminishing returns again. Same thing with E, and then yeah. So running short on time, and I'm going to skip through some of these soil properties, but essentially what we saw is that bulk density decreased as we increased the amendment. Soil organic matter increased as we increased the amount of amendment that we applied. Nitrogen in the soil actually increased from the spring to the fall, so it actually able to retain more nitrogen. So it's holding on to it, which was good. Same with phosphorus. It actually bound up more phosphorus in the soil. And so, yeah, kind of to summarize some of this work that we have going on, number one is from these plot studies, this is just one growing season. Really promising results and really positive for what we can kind of maybe push out into the landscapes. But the second year of that study, we're kind of in the middle. It's not really beginning now, but we're in the middle of that. In general, we're not seeing significant differences among common compost products. One thing that I will say is that all of our products were commercially available and certified by the U.S. Composting Council. So my recommendation for now is that if you're using a product made by that, or that has that U.S. Composting Council certification, the seal of testing assurance, then I would expect that you're going to have the same benefits as if you used any other approved product. More is better for some of our parameters, but in general, 1 to 2 cubic yards seem to be performing fairly similarly, and we may not need to be still recommending 4 cubic yards. And it seems like right now, 50 to 75% reduction in irrigation may be possible with incorporating our compost there. Kind of want to point you to a couple of things. We have a guidance document that we developed for, really it was intended for the development industry and the landscaping industry, basically a how-to on amending soils in new residential landscapes. So we kind of cover a lot of what I've gone over today as far as, what's going on with soils in the urban environment so that they end up in poor condition. Why is it? We kind of talk a little bit more about organic amendments than what I talked about here in this the second part. One key that we focus a lot more on is what I alluded to before, which is the U.S. Composting Council's seal of testing assurance, and looking at certain characteristics for the compost material. So if you were a landscaper or your landscape company is buying in bulk, they would want to know some characteristics about the compost. And then part 3 is really kind of going through the implementation, and we have sort of an appendix for some long-term considerations. We also had this reviewed by a lot of our technical folks here at UF, but also in industry. So some folks from FDEP, some of our faculty at UF, as well as where's Doc Brown, Eric Brown from Massey Services. And Massey has gone into actually doing some of this amending on their own as a private company, partnering with developers. We also include sort of a field sheet that kind of walks you through what the what the steps are for basically anybody that's going to do this. So I would say, for example, if you have a turf lot or a landscape that has failed and you're looking at replacing it, I would highly recommend, going and having your soil amended and then putting down the sod. It's an investment that will, basically, in my opinion, and we're working on ways to get it those numbers, it will pay for itself eventually. It's also available here on the FDEP website. I can put that link in the chat at the end here, if you'd like to kind of pull that up and take a look. And the last thing I'll kind of mention is we've been working with the UF Law School, the Conservation Law Clinic, to develop an example ordinance for how local governments might implement a requirement for amending soils, just because the way that development is kind of being done, the soil compaction, the poor quality of soil or material that's brought in, it just leads to so many issues. Lots of excess water that doesn't need to be applied, a lot of pest issues as well because of the conditions that are developing in the landscape. And we did basically a nationwide review of some ordinances to come up with this. We have an EDIS document that walks you through, or walks the local government through each of the sections that are shown here, kind of giving guidance on how they might tweak or adapt it to their local government or local situation. And hopefully that will be approved for publication here in the next month or so. It's currently being reviewed by UF faculty. And so with that, I will acknowledge a lot of folks who have put in work to make a lot of this research go. Yvonne Radovanovich and Ron Fox are 2 of my grad students. And then we have several different faculty here from UF that are, that have gone in and helped with a lot of this. Several of our partners here, Philip Heisey on Top of the World is fantastic, Life Soils, Harvest Quest, Scott's company, who's helped with some of our studies, and then the funding that we received from the Florida Turf Grass Association, FNGLA, Swift Mud, and FDEP. We couldn't do the work we can without that support. So many thanks to them. And with that, I will take any questions that you might have.
Okay, everybody, if you have any questions, if you look at the bottom of your screen where it says chat, go ahead and click on that. And that way we can see what your question is and go ahead and get it answered. Looks like James has a question there. So if you want to put it in the chat box. But thank you so much for that. That's really important information. I know that we do have a lot of residents here in Hernando County that have lawns that fail, and they need some information on how to maybe do things a little bit different so that their next lawn will not fail. And it will last, it will look good and last for many, many years. So like I said, if anybody has a question, if you want to go ahead and put it in. And we have Lily Browning here today also. She's our Hernando County Florida Friendly Landscape coordinator. and she works with a lot of lawn questions and irrigation and watering questions also.
I do, yes. I didn't really plan on showing up at this meeting. That's why I'm here in Cube Land and Gen Pop here. So if you hear any background noise, that's why.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah. Yes, I work for the water department. So what you're doing is very, very interesting to me. And I do promote it a lot in my classes, talking about these compost amendments and, how useful and how, I think, these things take longer than we want them to, but in the years to come, with all the growth we're going to have, I really think it's the way to go.
Well, I'll tell you an anecdotal story. This is from, I think it was from Lake County or Sumter County. It was a Taylor Morrison development over there. And they were sort of evaluating whether the developer was basically evaluating whether they wanted to do the amending of the lawns with all their homes. And so they did the command came in and basically amended a few of the lots early on. And then they had this meeting where, it was a lot of the homeowners were upset because most of the lawns are failing. And, they're, becoming a big issue for the developer. And on the way out, this one lady comes up to Darren Midland, who's with Harvest Quest and Life Soils, and says, I don't know why my neighbors are having such a hard time with their lawns. I don't really do anything, and my lawn's just fine. I don't know what the problem is. And he's like, well, where do you live? And it turns out she was at one of the lawns that basically, had been amended. And it's like, okay. Honestly, what we see and we see in the field is, number one, the lawn's established a lot quicker with this soil, with the amendment. It's an incentive to the developer to, it's almost insurance to not have lawns be an issue that divides you and your residents.
Mhm.
And we're getting at sort of this water conservation potential and how much it could benefit. We've seen sort of where it might take. The other thing that we've seen too is that the establishment period, establishment irrigation, typically, they have to cut it back after 30 days rather than going the full 60 days.
Wow.
The soil holds the water so much that you can't irrigate it every day because
Wow,
it's
that's
holding
fantastic.
on to it. Yeah, and the turf grass takes it up, but it only takes up so much. So if you're irrigating every day and expecting, because you're used to irrigating and establishing on this, loose soil, it doesn't hold water. You kind of create some issues if you do that. So you have to basically cut it back. And I think they went back to like every other day during the 30 days or something like that.
Nice. I believe I was reading, I'm sure it was a UF blog or might have been on IFAS or something, but they were, giving recommendations, the ideal situation when you build a house. And they were talking about trying to save the topsoil, like in a specific location. When you clear the lot. Could you touch on that, or how practical is that?
Absolutely. That's not a difficult thing to do. And a lot of developers, well, unfortunately, what some developers might do is they'll clear the lot, clear the site, and then scrape the topsoil. And some of them will sell it back to the homeowners, which is kind of, I don't know, kind of like, come on, guys.
Wow.
It's nickel and dime. But yeah, there's two things that'll happen. Either, with anytime you change the elevation of a lot, master grading, you are either cutting and then you're removing that soil that was there and you're getting down to a lower, deeper soil. And so that topsoil that was there, that organic material that had built up over time, is removed from the site. Or if they're building up the lot, that historic organic layer or superficial layer is now buried maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 feet down. Sure. So the soil that is now at the surface is nothing like the soil that was there in the pre-developed condition. it's not biologically active. It doesn't have this buildup of organic matter. And so by incorporating the compost, what we see is, to kind of put a little bit of a, I guess a little bit of a spin, but it's kind of, kickstarting that soil formation process. One of the things that the landscapers will say is that it takes, 3 to 4 years maybe for a landscape to kind of stabilize. Like there's issues that are going on, and a lot of things come up in those first couple of years. But as the landscape matures, it kind of creates its own sort of, starts to build that organic matter and so forth. It gets a little easier to manage. And what we're seeing is that our soil properties, what we're able to kind of do with incorporating compost is kind of push through that first 5 years. That's what we see as far as like a lot of the soil properties that change. And we're not seeing the issues that a lot of developers have and so forth. So, yeah.
Okay, we had a couple questions here from James.
Great.
And he asks, most of this is for new lawns. What can be done for lawns that were not composted, top dressing? And he asks, what was the frequency of irrigation in your studies?
Yep.
And he asks, is Hernando County's rule of once a week irrigation going to be sufficient?
Yeah. So the first question, sorry, I forgot what the first one was.
Sure. Most of this is for new lawns.
Right.
What can be done for lawns that were not, that didn't have the compost put in before the lawn was put in, like top dressing?
Yeah. Top dressing is one way that anecdotally we have, homeowners seem to think that there is a benefit from using compost top dressing. And in some places, similar to Alachua County and some others, when you have fertilizer bans, they have exceptions for top dressing where that can be put down. So usually what happens is that they will aerate the soil, pull the plugs, and then top dress on top of that. And it's usually a finer compost material so that it can kind of work its way down between the blades and into the holes that have been left by the aeration process. We see some benefits to that. We're just starting a study at Citra to kind of look at that more specifically in a kind of a controlled setting. We actually just sodded the plots earlier this month, and our plan is to start the top dressing scheduling of that sort of later this year. So we don't have a lot of sort of, okay, if you top dress, you can reduce your irrigation by this much. We don't have that yet. Would we like, we kind of have that as a target. Keep in mind, when you're incorporating 4 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet in that initial application for new lawns, the typical top dressing is about 0.5 cubic yard per 1,000 square feet. So it's a much lower amount that you're putting down. So even if we needed to build up to 4 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet cumulatively, that would take a 4-year process to do that. So there's a lot of questions about, well, how much of that organic matter that's put down with the top dressing actually works its way into the soil and is retained? How much of those nutrients? Could we top dress with a higher rate and get better? We definitely see that, that what Massey is one of the companies. They have also started doing the top dressing, and one of the things that they like about it is, as I understand it, they have sort of a subscription plan for their homeowners where they come out and do as much as needed to maintain the lawn. They like the top dressing with compost because it's a slow release fertilizer, and they don't have to come out as frequently to mow it. They don't have to come out as frequently to address issues. They don't have to put down products, so they save money on that side. So it's that was a bit of a paradigm shift for me. I didn't realize landscape companies were doing that now. The next question was, what was the irrigation of our study? In Ocala, it was it was following Ocala in Marion County is a little bit different because part of it is in St. John's, part of it is in Swiftmud. They follow the St. John's scheduling, so it is twice per week during the warm months, once per week during the the dormant months. But what we're seeing, we've seen anecdotally that this is working, in lots of areas that are doing the once per week. Manatee County, Sarasota County, they have sort of the same kind of irrigation restrictions, 1 day per week. And then the last question that I forgot that one.
I think that was the last one. He asked if Hernando County's rule of once a week irrigation is sufficient.
Okay.
And I know that during the dry time, if it gets really dry from spring through summer, it could be a little difficult.
Mhm.
Obviously, right now we've started getting regular rain, and I would hope that most people's irrigation is shut off.
Yeah.
If it's raining a couple times a week, you don't need to water once a week just because you're allowed to. It should be turned off because you're just wasting water at that point. So for most of the year, once a week irrigation is just fine. During a drought, during an unusual extended dry period, things can get a little tough, but that's when having a really healthy lawn helps, because a healthy lawn is going to be able to survive a dry period much better.
Yeah.
An unhealthy lawn, something that's kind of on life support, over fertilized, cut too short, it's going to be the first one to die when it stops raining for a couple days.
Mhm.
And we do have a couple of test plots, if you want to call them, here in a development in Hernando County that we've been watching.
Mhm.
I know Bill's boss, Jim Davis, was heavily involved in that. There's, well, I think one gentleman owned 3 homes and he allowed us, he got new sod in the home that he lived in. He had the company that you mentioned put down the command, and I watch his water bill does not get high really at all, even through the establishment period. We've had people, because the sod companies tell them just water each zone an hour a day. So, $1,000 water bill was not unheard of during that establishment period if people were really going overboard.
Yep.
So his might have gone up maybe $40, in a month in the establishment period. So, but he really followed our establishment guide, and his lawn still looks really good, doesn't it, Bill?
Yes, I haven't been out there for a couple months. I need to give him a call and go out there and look at it. But I spoke with him just a few weeks ago, and I asked, with the dry spring and the lack of rain, what has it done to your lawn? He said, looks fine.
Yeah.
And everybody else in the neighborhood is going into a panic, desperate to be able to water more often because their lawns are dying. So it really does make a difference.
And Bill touched on too, that mowing high, that is so extraordinarily important.
It really is.
Yeah.
The one other thing I kind of touched on was, the pictures that I showed of the model home. Though I should have mentioned that was actually 2.5 years after the initial incorporation. And what we see with the organic matter, something we actually measured in the soil over time, is that it actually increased over time in the amended lots. You would think that maybe it would burn off and decrease, and maybe these soils would kind of merge or kind of converge over time. But what we saw is that separation actually increased with time, and it was actually getting better over time. So it was surprising, just because it wasn't what I would have expected to occur. So yeah, that's interesting that it it grew more organic matter. Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't see any other questions in the chat box here. If anybody does have any other questions or needs any extra help, Dr. Bean's email is right here. Feel free to call our office or email me. Feel free to contact Lily. Hopefully most of you watch our classes on a regular basis and follow both of us on Facebook. If you don't, then shame on you. You need to jump on the train here and be able to get current updates about all the different classes we have scheduled. And let me go ahead and stop the recording here, I guess.